Well, good afternoon and welcome to the first of the seminars of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion, Trinity Term 2012. Very pleased to host this seminar in collaboration with the Order Project studying God's order, man's order and the order of nature. And that's a joint project mainly with LSC and UCSD, with some Oxford interest as well. We're very pleased to have a extremely eminent speaker this evening, Professor Tom McLeish, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research at the University of Durham. He's won several awards, both in Europe and the United States, for his work on the molecular rheology of polymers, including the Weissenberg Award of the European Society of Rheology and the Gold Medal of the British Society of Rheology. His research interests include molecular rheology and the processing of entangled polymeric fluids, macromolecular biophysics, issues of theology, ethics and science. He's published over 130 scientific papers and reviews and is co-author of the collaborative volume Values in Higher Education. He's also involved in science communication with the public via regular radio, TV and schools lectures, discussing issues from the physics of slime to the interaction of faith and science. He's a fellow of the Institute of Physics, the Royal Society of Chemistry and the American Physical Society. He'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then I think there'll be ample time for questions. So would you please welcome Professor Tom McLeish to talk about why is science such a pain? The Book of Job, and an overlooked ancient narrative for science studies. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much. Angela, that's very kind of you indeed. How's the sound quality the quantity? I can't do anything about the quality of what follows. I'm delighted to be having followed the fortunes of the Ian Ramsey Centre from afar, from actually this gorgeous place, for some while. It's a real privilege and I'm very excited to be here. I'm not looking forward so much to the first bit, but I am looking forward to question time very much, because every time I do this, I find there's an immense richness in gatherings like this around the discussion. So thanks very much for the introduction. It's lovely. I realise you're... no, I don't know whether I should say this, but a year on, one still got a little bit of the glow. That was I realise that's a slightly out-of-date paragraph, and the Royal Society were also kind enough to let me a year ago. So that's I should add that. But that's enormously fun, because it opens up the archives and history of that institute to the eyes of someone open to the airbrushed out history of thought around science that I suspect I'm hoping to unearth a little bit more. I should apologise for don't worry, you are at the right seminar. I will try and avoid the rheology of slime, molecular biophysics from time to time, but it may crop up because in discussion with either theology or science or both, there is a point at which flying at 39,000 feet is simply not good enough. And diving down into the long grass, what I think the humanities scholars call close readings, are functions that we cannot do without. And I find in this general area, as a comment, a close reading of the hour by hour, minute by minute experience in the lab, as it were, or with the theoretician's pen, and the neuron by neuron firing of the theologian or the theological reflector on the long history of the philosophy of science is something that we need to get into. So, of course, with 45 minutes it's hard, but I'm hoping to give at some point a little taste of a close reading of the Book of Job, but see the forthcoming book for a little bit longer. So, so that's where I come from. Durham, we have immense fun there. Of course, being Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research is a very privileged day job. It does kick us up to that high altitude most of the time, but it also gets one into terrible trouble, because from the position of huge privilege, being able to have some form of overview of a university's research landscape, if you like. Every so often you see just the most fascinating thing going on down there, and diving down and flying low, as it were, in the theology department and others, is something that's been an immense richness to me. But before we begin, or as we begin, I should admit to my prejudices so that you know where I'm coming from and can excuse some of my directions. So I'm a working physicist, as you've heard, and adore and love science, and have done so for since I was very, very small. But as a member of the science community, the very fact that one can ring fence a science community, one of the painful aspects of that is the reception of or lack of reception of science, or lack of appreciation or enjoyment of science in the population at large, and the language that distances scientific thinking and enjoyment and wholeness from a cultured behaviour. C.P. Snow commented this a long time ago. Perhaps what he said is a little anachronistic in detail, but nonetheless, Shakespeare and Heisenberg are not as commonly celebrated and enjoyed. That's part of the pain that I'm coming from. But another aspect of this is that I am deeply sceptical of a sort of post-Enlightenment modern story that science is modern, or that science is new. If you like, that everything before 1609 was alchemy and darkness, and God said, let Newton be and then be light. All that sort of coffee table textbook science history stuff. But the coffee table books do exist, and they really do say that. So my prejudice is that what we now call science comes from a very long narrative history, whose dawn is at the dawn, whose dawn is the same dawn of anything we would wish to call civilization, or even humanity, perhaps. Of course, it's a prejudice, an unevidenced prejudice, but that's where I believe. And that the current perception that science is modern is a harm. As I said, it impoverishes well-being. It certainly paralyses public debate on issues of science, technology, and the earth. Witness the reception of genetically modified organisms in North America and in Europe to cultures that share the same Western scientific inheritance, ostensibly very closely linked cultural inheritances, but for one opens a door to a new technology, and the other slams it shut, locks and bars it. So and much of the reason for that paralysis of public debate is, I think, around these issues. And of course, the narrative that science is new and somehow special, and somehow the purview of the expert, certainly distorts all talk around science and religion. So there are some prejudices. They were enforced to me when I read a pithy essay by George Steiner, who is a humanities scholar, as you know, of huge distinction, but who likes to write and reflect on the sciences, perhaps rather more rosy tintedly than he might do. But I read this. I think this is from Real Presences. Only art, says Stein at some point, can go some way to reconciling us with the inhuman otherness of matter. Now, I don't know whether there are any epiphany sentences that you've read in your lives where you suddenly had these great aha moments. So that sentence was a big aha moment for me in two ways. One was, aha, absolutely right. There is a job to be done with reconciling the human with the total inhuman otherness of matter. That's a large part of the human predicament. But George, not just art, because if science is for anything, if there is an etiology, if you like, of science, then might it just be for that? Does it not belong in a long history of humans seeking to be reconciled out of our ignorance, out of our fear, out of our lack of understanding, out of our being mastered over by chaotic, inhuman, physical nature? And you can see where there might be some resonances with Job there. Just another background here. Let me, as part of the backdrop, talk about a fascinating project that colleagues at Durham very recently finished under a European grant. This is Phil Macnaghten and colleagues around the specific public reception and debate a quality thereof, of a particular transformational science or technology. This is nanotechnology. They call it the DEEPEN project, and I can never work out what the acronym stands for. It's Deepening Ethical Engagement in and Participation in Emerging Nanotechnologies. But DEEPEN is good. You can pun on that for a long, long time. Now, what these social scientists, it's a collaboration between social scientists of public science policy, some theological informationists of the project as well, and nanotechnologists working in the field. They used largely qualitative social science methods to peel back the surface of the rather rebarbative discussions on the grey goo, remember the nanotechnology debate, the unleashing the tiny semi-sentient particles that may be of great good, particularly in medical technologies, but may also be of great harm. And what the project, for me, it had many, many interesting outcomes, but for me one of the most powerful was the identification that underneath the ostensibly technical debate of risk, danger, and technical ignorance leading to unforeseen problematic health circumstances, these were proxies for the real narrative debate that was very much subterranean, very much subsurface. And the project identified 5 what they termed ancient narratives or underlying narratives, which were the real vehicles for debate. And they were these. And they're recognizable from mythologies, aren't they? Be careful for what you wish for. Opening risk, opening Pandora's box. Once out, you can't get the flies back in again. Messing with nature. Nature as a sacred, distant, fixed object, arena. The community being kept in the dark. Deliberate power play of ignorance. And the old narrative that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and this new science and technology was just going to enhance that evil. Now, the philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy, who was an associate of the project, has responded in a fascinating essay to this, and has identified what he does is to lump these narratives into a set of ancient and a set of modern. He calls these the ancient narratives. Well, one was obviously ancient, and these 2 more modern ones performs a Marxist analysis of the modern narratives, but summarizes the 5 narratives as the narrative of desire. Be careful for what you desire. The narrative of evil and the origin. Of course, Pandora's box is a just so story. It's origin of evil. The idea of the sacred. Why don't you mess with nature? Because nature is a sacred object, and these 2 modern ones are the narratives of alienation and exploitation. Now, the reason that this fascinated me was, of course, because it explained. Let's take the GM issue. Explained why one reason why these debates might never get anywhere. You see, if you believe you're having a debate about technical issues of risk, well informed by modern methods of calculating goods and harms. But what is actually going on, at least in those suspicious of the new technologies you're proposing to introduce, is an adducement of ancient narratives, then you're simply talking past each other without realizing it. And anything can happen. And indeed, anything does happen. So identifying this is very, very powerful. The second reason that I was interested in it is because, look at the ancient narratives. Do you notice something about them? They're all Greek, they're all pagan, and yet they're alive. They're alive and kicking today. Where are the ancient narratives that sing a different song, with different sort of music? So hence the project to look at themes of religious literature, and particularly the Bible, for narratives to do with the story that we now call science. Of course, that would be quite anachronistic to call science at the time of the writings of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, of course, but there is an earlier chapter in which what now it has bubbled up within the human and is now science, is something then. What might it be? So that's part of the search, and hence Job. Well, the question is, so Bible and science, part of the problem of talk of science and theology is, of course, exactly or explicitly the sort of missed narratives or missed coupling of narratives I've talked about. The Bible and science is an anachronistic dislodgement of different narratives. The word science and scientists is a neologism after all. But if we start using different vocabulary, more open, more long-lived vocabulary around wisdom, vocabulary around the natural world, and start looking around issues of reconciliation, picking up Steiner, understanding wisdom and nature, then those keys open up, of course, a huge literature, in particular the Bible, Old and New, of which, incidentally, Genesis emerges as a rather, in my view, minor, rather late, rather baroque text. So another one of our issues of the science and religion debate, if you like, is that most satellites orbit around Genesis chapter 1 still, rather annoyingly, when there are far weightier planets to explore. Where I'm going is, of course, to suggest that Job is the Jupiter of the Old Testament solar system in this case. Now, the final motivation for this is that whenever I have suggested to my scientific colleagues that they might like, in late night conference discussions at the bar, the drift off molecular rheology and drift on to things like ancient literature to do with scientific thinking or science and theology, as it very often does, we get to the point where we say, well, have you ever read the book of Job? It's extraordinary. Well, no. Well, have you ever read this extraordinary poem called The Lord's Answer at the end of the book of Job? Well, no. So I've said, well, why don't you go back to your hotel room? I know it's going to be there, you see. Thank you to our friends the Gideons. Go and read The Lord's Answer. What's the thing called The Lord's Answer? It's Job chapter 38, 39, 40. Come back tomorrow at breakfast and tell me what you think. I don't know a scientist who hasn't come back, jaw dropped, and said, that's beautiful. I never knew that was there. What an extraordinary poem. Why? Well, they've gone and they've read, questions, and I think I've got some excerpts on. So excerpt number 1 on your hymn sheet, it has some starts with some quotes from Job. The Lord answers in about 150 stanzas of questions, and they're questions to do with nature. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea? Where is the way to the abode of light? From whose womb comes the ice? Do you know the laws of the heavens? And can you apply them to the earth? More on the sheet. Number 3, where is the realm of dwelling of light? And as far as darkness, where is its place? The stars are meant, the constellations. Number 5, there, can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loose Orion's belt? This extraordinary idea that the laws of the heavens and the laws of the earth are somehow connected. And then later in the poem, from the kingdom, as it were, of the stars and the earth and the meteorological phenomena, we move to the animals, the birds, their navigation ability, the lions, and the birthing of mountain goats. It's been pointed many times, of course, by scholars of Job, that the animal life mentioned, no tame animal is mentioned. All the examples of the wild, untamed, unkempt, the part of creation beyond the boundaries of human control. So there's why do scientists respond with such astonishment to Job? One is the breathtaking beauty, of course. One is the fact that this poem takes the form of question, and as every scientist knows, the key imaginative creative step in doing any science is not pace what we encourage our undergraduates gotten help them to think, to imagine, let alone our school pupils, is not to find the right answer, the one that's at the back of the textbook in the examiner's crib sheet. It's to ask the imaginative question. Yeah. And those of you who are nodding at me because you're scientists will know that the key educative step in moving from the undergraduate world to the successful research world is to somehow help these young, wonderful, bright people who've had 12 years of being trained in giving the right answer to start asking the right questions. It's a miracle that any of them ever make it. How wonderful they are. Questions, that's the other extraordinary thing. The third ingredient of the Lord's answer that is fascinating to scientists is its extraordinary holding together of the balance of order and chaos. And how, again, there is little, even now, still out there, even with Stephen Gleick's book, around the dual engagement of science with the world that is as happy to explore the chaotic and the random, the stochastic. In fact, that the chaotic and the stochastic is actually essential to the process of science, as well as the ordered. If you like, just as much the elliptical orbits of the planets on the one hand, and the ability to predict eclipses thousands of years before they happen, and on the other hand, the emergent structures of life, leaves, trees and materials, that would not be so without an underpinning, seething, chaotic order, which is statistical mechanics. And of course, the potential and possible disorder within quantum mechanics, but I'm not going to go there because I think the jury is out. So there's a taste of if you like, perhaps an anachronistic reception of Job, but I think it touches on an atavistic vein as well. Now, the interpretation of the Lord's answer, theologically, within Old Testament studies, has of course been fraught with anguish and angst. To understand that, we'd better just remind ourselves, I'm sure, in Oxford and in a seminar like this, this audience will all be familiar with the book, but so let me just remind you how Job goes. It's one of the most precious items of ancient wisdom literature. It has to be. David Klein's, who is probably one of the leading Job scholars, just about to publish his final volume of this magisterial 3-volume commentary, calls it the most intense book, theologically and intellectually, of the Old Testament, and speaks, one assumes, autobiographically when you get to his commentary on the Lord's answer. In chapter 39, he says, even those of us who have grown old with the book of Job, and I've met David, he's not dissembling, still get a frisson of excitement whenever, after 37 chapters of Job and his so-called comforters Job railing at God for an answer, and them circling around these unending legalistic arguments of retributive justice, suddenly, oh surprise, God actually speaks. It's an extraordinary theatrical moment. Okay, you know the story. There's a prologue, there's a Satan, there's a tempter, and Job is lifted by God as an exemplar of a good and worthy man. In this behind-the-scenes view, the Satan rails at God and says, well, this is only because he's rich and blessed. If you took all that away, he would curse you. And that's the backstory which the reader sees, but no one in the scene themselves sees for Job's suffering. He ends up on his ash heap. He loses everything, apart from actually for his wife, but her role, and big gender studies view on critique of Job, her role is to tell him to curse God and die, and then she disappears off stage left. There's three of his so-called friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, circle around him with arguments. There are three, it's a very structured book, there are 3 cycles of speeches, though the third, it's pretty clear that the text has become at some stages in its presumably long history rather disconnected and disjoint towards the third cycle, and there are a dozen of reconstructed ways of putting it back together again. It gets very intense there as well. There's an extraordinary break taken in the middle from hymn to wisdom, and the Lord finally answers, and there's a closing narrative. Now, the subject of the book is often referred to cheaply, perhaps, as the problem of pain. Yes, Job is suffering. But it's interesting. None of his demands ever emerges as a demand that his suffering finish. It's rather surprising in a way. That's not what he asks. He asks that his suffering be understood, and he asks for a rationale. And his issue is that the three friends have a legalistic, very moralistic view that the world, the structure of their cosmos, incorporates retributive justice. So the righteous receive the benefits and the wicked will suffer. And of course, by degrees, they are his friends, so they don't want to conclude the obvious conclusion at the beginning. Job is suffering, therefore, work it through. But by the end of the second cycle, that is exactly where they get to, that Job himself must have sinned. So his invocation to God is doubly into sort of legal courthouse. He finds his friends wrong, but he finds himself wrongly abused, and wishes to be vindicated. But is underlying this argument of a need to understand his suffering is a further second argument or accusation that he makes of the Creator. The first being that he's suffering unjustly, but the second is that he is under a chaotic, meaningless, vindictive strike of creation, just as is the cosmos as a whole. In other words, that God is no more in control of the cosmos than the Creator is in control of Job's legal context. So Job accuses God of being out of control of creation, and that's one of the underlying narratives. Now, nonetheless, the Lord's answer, which is this one beautiful creation poem, has been itself the object of severe disavowal for years. It's been criticised as Robinson calls the God of the answer a charlatan deity. This is not an answer. This is not an adequate answer to Job's accusations. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Well, hang on, I'm not asking about the foundations of the earth. I'm asking why I'm suffering, even though I'm a righteous man. Do you know the way to the storehouses of the hail? What has that got to do with it? You see where the debate goes. So it's either angry, or in the conclusion of a number of scholars, it's simply tacked on. It's just not part of the. It's not part of the story. And as the text is clearly getting disjointed towards the end, it's a sign that something is wrong. So here's William Blake's. Actually, under this light, you probably can't see this, but William Blake's beautiful engraving of God afflicting Job. So. Is this really right? So this is the point at where we need to take a little closer look at the book and ask whether a questioning poem around those areas of the world that we now call astronomy and geology and biology and zoology and meteorology is an appropriate answer to Job's double accusation that the cosmos is unjust and the cosmos is out of control. So what I'd like to do, or what I've attempted to do in the longer version, I'm very happy to email anyone who would like the longer article, is to take us through a nature trail through Job. It's another addition to the pile. I mean, there are so many readings of this book. Feminist readings. Muriel Spark even wrote a novel based on Job that some of you might know. The only problem, but I don't think anyone has quite taken, if you like, what I call a nature trail through Job. I wanted to ask the question: well, given the wisdom of creation, the seeking of wisdom of creation is the single dominant theme in the Lord's answer, which is ostensibly the reconciliatory moment of the whole book. Where is it everywhere else? Is it really true that the Lord's answer is substantially rootless in the rest of the book? And I was both delighted and surprised to find that not only does every single motif in the Lord's answer, whether it's the wild ass, the wild donkey is a great friend through the book, or the flooded wadis, or the dry desert, or the earthquake, or the constellations, all of them, without exception, appear through the three discourses, through the three cycles of speeches, for one thing. And for the other thing, it is possible to take a trail through the book, a close but very selective reading, where one follows the argument of the speeches without leaving the narrow nature trail. Every speech of Job and his friends, and they go Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, Job, and then the cycle repeats. Every speech adduces nature language to the argument. So let's see. I don't know how many. Is everyone within sight of a handout? We just got. That's super. That's lovely. So let's. Let's have a look at Job's very first speech, which is excerpt 9 on page 2. He starts with a creation story that day. That's a day's creation story. That day would it have become darkness, the clouds had settled upon it, the eclipses had affrighted. It's an initial day, but instead of a day on which the first thing that's created is light, it's a day on which the first thing that's created is darkness. Strong allusion to Genesis. It's actually the first day of Job's life. It's not the day of creation. But then he goes on, with that curses of days who laid a spell on it, those skilled at rousing Leviathan. Would that the stars of its dawn had been darkened and never seen the eyelids of morning. So you have a dark created day, not a new one, but there's the Leviathan. Now, the Leviathan has pride of place in chapter 40 in the Lord's answer. And this is very famously been said. One other aspect of the Lord's answer to Job, I mentioned that the animals that it refers to are all wild. The pinnacle, the peak of its discourse are around these two extraordinary semi-mythical animals. They're sometimes identified as the crocodile and the hippopotamus, but I wonder if they're really supposed to be actually just beyond the edge of our king, almost in the place where we wrote there be dragons. But the Leviathan is the pinnacle of creation in the Job poem, not human. Just go back one to excerpt 8 on the hymn sheet. Beneath it are the sharpest of potsherds. It leaves a mark like a threshing sledge on the mud. It makes the deep boil like a cauldron, makes the water bubble like an ointment pot. Behind it leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep hoar-headed. Upon earth there is not its like. A creature born to know no fear. All that are lofty fear it. It is king over all proud beasts. The God of Job's answer is more proud, more pleased with the frothing Leviathan than any other element of his creation. Yet this is, of course, not the first point where the Leviathan is mentioned. Let's just go on to excerpt 10 in the first round of speeches. This is where we're with Eliphaz now, who's beginning this discussion of the wicked perish and the good prosper. here are the elements. He mentions the destroying wind of God. By the breath of God they perish. The wind of his fury they perish. The divine voice from the wind, from the whirlwind. Then a wind swept past my face. A whirlwind made my body quiver. There stood a figure unrecognizable. A form was before my eyes, and I heard a thunderous voice. So when God answers Job finally out of the whirlwind, it isn't actually the first time that we've had a thunderous voice from the whirlwind in the book as a whole. The natural wonders and eclipsed darkness. By daylight they meet with darkness, at noonday grope as though it were night. So the chaotic giving and removal of darkness, which is a theme later in Job, is already mentioned very early on in Eliah's speech. Plant life, plants and trees, are also, particularly in the second cycle, make a strong appearance. But here, earlier on, this is excerpt 11, in a Bildad, talks about a lush plant in the sun's warmth spreading its shoots in the garden. Its roots twine about the heaps of stones. It takes firm hold among the rocks. But if it's torn from its place, that place disowns it with "I never saw you." That's a metaphor for the wicked. But there are some extraordinary insights put into, by the writer, the mouths of these ostensibly shallow friends. Although their worldview is shallow and brittle, or remains shallow and brittle, the subtlety of the writing endows some of their speeches with some very interesting ideas. This is a thorny ground. It was almost Macnaghten, actually. The parable of the sower might, I wonder, have had its roots somewhere here. But this isn't a thorny soil that causes the plants to wither. This is a thorny soil that collaborates with the roots of the plants and lives together cooperatively with them. I must just refer to this is not on the sheet, but an extraordinary similar idea from Eliphaz in chapter 5, where Eliphaz is warning Job and says this: "At ruin and blight you will mock." Eliphaz is talking about a future in which Job is vindicated, he's repented, he's healed, he's admitted his sin and is forgiven, and so forth. At ruin and blight you will mock. You will have no fear of the wild beasts, for you will be in covenant with the stones of the field, and the wild animals will be at peace with you. Now, for those of you who know your Old Testament, you know there are strong echoes of Hosea, chapter 6, and Isaiah's vision of the new heavens, the new earth there. But that word covenant, which really is the biblical Hebrew word for covenant, has caused translators to tremble, their pens to tremble. And it isn't translated covenant in every version by any means. Because who can imagine, because we know what a covenant means. Exodus chapter 15, you know what a covenant, Genesis chapter 15, you know what a covenant means in the Old Testament. This is not something to be entered into lightly, and a covenant with stones. So you see what I mean about some rather deep and interesting relationship language between the human and the non-human, surfacing even in some of the speeches of the friends. As the cycles roll, so a momentum builds up, and two things happen. One is, as I'm hoping to describe this to you, there are clearly two parallel arguments going on, parallel and linked, sort of projective spaces. There's the legal argument around sin and retribution, and there's reflecting that the backdrop of the argument around creation, chaos and order. Yeah. Now, the legal argument dances around. One reason that these cycles take a long time to get around to their crescendo is because the last thing the friends want to do is to come out and accuse Job directly of wickedness. One of them attributes his suffering not to his own wickedness, but to his family, his sons and daughters, who are living it up a bit too much. And they've all got excuses. But one by one, they become the victims of the inevitability, of the rigidity of their own arguments. And an extraordinary thing happens towards the end of the second cycle when the accusations of the friends reach a sort of crescendo. I couldn't help feeling when I was reading it over and over and over again. I'll tell you what came into my mind. It was Ravel's Bolero came into my mind. Because it's almost, to me, it's a literary equivalent of Bolero, which circles round. Like, remember the little ostinato rhythm? That one. Going on all the time. Starts very, very quiet, and it just taps and taps away. It's a little like the arguments of the friends. And this winding little tune that goes from flutes to saxophones and so on. And there's a moment at which, and it's rather attractive, it's sort of an attractive little dance, but there's a moment where Ravel just comes clean, and the latent menace, it's a very menacing piece of music actually, suddenly bursts out, and the tune becomes horrible, becomes ugly, and the heavy brass take it on, and it all gets twisted and deformed, and it's quite a sort of overwhelming moment. And this happens in Job. There's an overwhelming moment where, for the first time, Job himself is accused of sin directly by himself, and it's like the whole argument's become ugly. And what do you do now? And I think this moment in the text where things unravel is partly a consequence of this emotional crescendo. And you know what Ravel does with the piece there? He just ends it. That's it. I don't know where to take this. One of the most unsatisfactory endings of the whole of 20th century, but maybe there was nowhere else to go. Now, there are other things, however, you can do with music when the storm breaks. Right? Think of Mussorgsky's Night on a Bare Mountain. Mussorgsky doesn't end it there. Or think of the Pastoral Symphony. Maybe most people here will know better. Think of what happens after the storm. The great lightning clashes and the thunder rolls and the timpanist is going mad, and then the storm rolls away and the little rolls of thunder, and then little tunes, new tunes start to be woven from on the flutes and the high strings, and the sun comes out, and the birds start singing, and there's a moment where the same thing happens with the book, the illusion for me is the heavy brass is for me when the cosmical image or the nature poem hits the structure of the cosmos as a whole, and so that's excerpt 13 on your sheet. Suddenly, the nature imagery lifts from the wild donkeys, the flooded wadis, the dry deserts, the capriciouses, the storms, to the entire cosmological sweep of Hebrew cosmology. It's very rare, actually, that we see a glimpse into what Hebrew cosmology might have been. Job and Bildad, both. This is excerpt 13 from chapter 22 and 26. Is God not in the height of heavens? Does he not look down on the topmost stars, highest they are? Yet you say, what does God know? Can he see through thick clouds to governs? Thick clouds veil him, and he cannot see as he goes about on his way on the vault of heaven. So you have it's not like the Aristotelian universe, but it is finite and it is bowl-shaped, and there's an extraordinary idea that clouds here, rather than just veiling the deity in a sort of mosaic way, would actually veil him in a way that he himself couldn't see through. And then Bildad. It is he who stretched out the north over chaos and suspended the earth from nothing. He wrapped up the waters in his clouds, but the clouds did not burst under their weight. He covered the site of his throne. He spread his cloud over it. He drew a circle upon the face of the waters as the boundary between light and darkness. An idea of the horror and immensity of hanging objects, the hanging suspended earth, the hanging clouds with their tons and tons of water ready to rain on the land miraculously. This is the heavy brass of the cosmological nature poetry that goes with the heavy brass of you, Job, have sinned, so you admit it. So what the writer of Job does at this point is not what Ravel does with Bolero. He doesn't give up. Well, of course, that's the debate. That's the scholarly debate. Might he have given up? Some scholars think he did, that was the original ending of the book. The current version, at any rate, as we have it, has a new tune starting. And this is where an extraordinary interleaving chapter 28 comes. It's the story of the Song of Wisdom. And it's an insert. It's another poem akin to the Lord's Answer later on. And it's the poem in search of wisdom. There is a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from ore. We start talking about the operation of mining precious metals and stones from the earth. Mortals put an end to the darkness. They search out the farthest recesses for all in the blackest darkness. Far from humans, they cut a shaft in places untouched by human feet. Far from other people, they dangle and sway. Hey ho, it's off to work we go. These are the miners under the ground, swinging with candle lamps in their hats from their ropes, and seeing in the dim reflection of their own lights the ores, the minerals, the gold, the silver, the subterranean encrusted underground world. It's a wonderful metaphor. It's another science metaphor, by the way. And I've, similarly, when my friends have read The Lord's Answer, the next exercise 2 is read chapter 28. And what is science if it is not learning to perceive and understand the world from underneath? The structures that are going on below the superficies of behaviour. Now, chapter 28. It doesn't immediately admit to its subject. It's got it back to front. It asks you to guess the subject. It starts talking about the underground world that the eagle doesn't see and that humans do. After a few verses, it admits it's asking for wisdom. Where can wisdom be found? And the sea is asked, and the sea says, I don't know. And the earth is asked, it says, I don't know. I've heard rumours of where it might be found, but I don't know where it is. And then it finishes with, God alone understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. This is the end of that excerpt, 14. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under heaven. Viewing and seeing, two different words in English, two different words in Hebrew too, that mean a deep perception of understanding, a sort of X-ray view into the physical solidity of creation. This is the one point actually where I had to say I disagree. Dare I disagree with David Kleins? I'm not sure I'm really allowed to disagree with David Kleins, but David finds that a banal ending to the Song of Wisdom. But I'm not sure, given the rest of what he says in his commentary, he's really right about himself. For as the cosmological arguments of this wonderful book unfold, it's clear that the cosmic, the physical nature pictures are not just a metaphor for wisdom, that the reconciliation to the physical world in understanding and knowledge really is where wisdom can be found. And the reason that God is wise is because his perception reflects, underscores, and revisits his creative act in the first place. And he knows the sinew and fibre and warp and weft of creation. So, we must move on because, as I warned you, close readings can take a long time, and there's much more to say. The final excerpt there I have for you from Job 31 is however one that we just must read before we go to the Lord's Answer again, because he, after the storm, in the quiet tune of wisdom, Job becomes much more reflective and self-reflective. And he does begin to ask, well, is it me? Did I do something wrong? Could I really have? And he goes back over his life. Did I ever look at a woman? Did I in that way? Did I ever? And I found this one extraordinary. If I made gold my trust, or said to find gold, you are my confidence. If I've rejoiced because my wealth was great, or because my hand had gained much. Now listen to this. If I have gazed with delight at the sun when it shone, or the moon in splendour, and my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, this also would be a punishable crime, for I would have been false to God above. He's asking whether he ever worshipped nature. You see, it's hard for us to understand that temptation, isn't it? Because when we get out of a taxi on a cloud-ridden night in a sodium glare of the middle of a city, and we see the moon covered by ragged clouds, that's one thing. But the same silvery orb marching in silence on a velvety sky lit by 1,000 Arabian stars in a Middle Eastern night is quite another. Quite another, especially when you're surrounded by the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, the Egyptians, who would kiss their hands at these things only too readily. And when you've been abandoned for centuries by the one you think has told you not to worship these things, it's to me, this is where I sort of get my hanky out for Job, because he's clearly been much closer to this than we anachronists would imagine. So, okay, there's a little taste. I had to give you that detailed taste. There's so much more to say and find, but let's just pan back for the last few minutes and take a wider perspective on perspectives on creation in Job. I think there are 6 alternative takes on creation we get within Job. We get the Friend's view that the book enshrines moral law. We get the view that it's some sort of eternal mystery. There are many points where the Friends accuse Job of, you'll never know this thing. Other resonances of the Lord's answer, do you know? We get the book of nature. We get the moral book that you can read for lessons in your spiritual and family and community life. You get Job's view in his worst moments that the creation is uncontrolled chaos. And that the rains, far from being these nice things that that cause crops to grow, are actually the rains that flood the wadis and tear the tents up, and when you don't need them. Oxford in May, April. What have we had? 2 months rain in a day or something. We know it too, but not like they did. I've just told you about this little glimpse into nature as an object of worship, and finally, this alternative view that comes in the chapter 28 song and in the Lord's answer, the way to wisdom. Now you might have picked up, I don't know, and I don't think I'm just reading into this. Some of these narratives, the narratives of exploitation and alienation, certainly the narratives of sacred, certainly the ancient narratives of evil and of desire, reappearing in the book of Job in rather different guise. So, $6 million question. What about the Lord's answer then? Now we've got back to it. Is it a tack on? Is it a glib put down? Is it a diversionary tactic? Is it a bit extra? Well, you'll have guessed by now that I don't think the Lord's answer is any of those things. And I think that actually theologically and logically in the book it belongs just where it does. And I think it does the most extraordinary things. And now there are a number of reasons why I think I'll just mention them briefly, and then you can tackle me as we discuss. It takes the accusation that God is out of control head on, and it asks Job, it deconstructs the idea of control. What do you mean by control? What would a universe be like that were controlled? The Lord's answer celebrates the openness, the fact that the wild ass is beholden to no man, and that the rains and the hail have their own storehouses. Okay. Secondly, it does actually release Job from his predicament. It does reconcile him, and it does heal him. Thirdly, all those questions. Those questions are actually introduced by very important, that Job is explicitly invited by God to stand up and debate. in language that doesn't belong to the addressing of an inferior, as all commentators, almost without exception, agree. It's participative and it's invitational. And my reading, I would recommend you try a reading where those questions, do you know the storehouses of the hail, one doesn't immediately read into those a power play of put down, of intellectual put down, but an invitation to engage with the Creator in the perceptive engaged wisdom that we heard earlier in chapter 28. It's appropriate because it affirms the significance of physical nature, which has been the metaphor of choice throughout the entire book to that point, and has become increasingly almost the dominant one after a subdominant beginning. And finally, and most controversially, it's eschatological. I think by that I mean that the Lord's answer to Job points beyond itself. It points to a future. It's the same future that Hosea and Isaiah thought of. It's the same future that in the New Testament we reach in St. Paul, with all creation groaning till the children of God be revealed, and in the Revelation to St. John, the same creation which is deeply physical and three-dimensional and crystalline and everything. It's part of that story. It's canonically part of that story, and I don't think people have thought very much about that. So it's eschatological because, context, the Hebrew vision of healed vision, the nature of wisdom in chapter 28, the underlying grasp of nature, and the openness of structure. So consequences to this for us, so what might a narrative play that draws on this ancient source do when it engages with the other ancient narratives at play that are left open-ended with nothing to engage with? Well, it might be that a healthy relationship with a non-human one is one that that takes on this very delicate balancing between the centralization and decentralization within Job. You see, the Lord's answer to this extraordinary double act. The healing power that's released to Job is the double act of the Leviathan, of humankind being completely decentered in one way, extremely, knocked off the final day of creation pinnacle and sent off to the periphery of creation, but then brought back in centrally to assume the search for the same search for wisdom that was in the creative act to start with. It's extraordinary double. The tension between that is a healing tension. It might help us because it will balance the order of the order and chaos. The fact there's always risk, there's always uncertainty, and I mentioned eschatology before. So I wonder what the consequence would be for a public discourse that with the book of Job, concluded that there are no predetermined histories or boundaries, that the deeply human, as embedded in this tradition, relationship with creation is one of invitation and participation and openness. One in which an intellectual engagement with the physical world could even be therapeutic. This is where people usually laugh, but I say, you've heard of science therapy, of art therapy and music therapy. What about science therapy? That is a logical that bizarre idea is in fact the logical conclusion of where I think I'm going. And new underlying narratives certainly need to play. And if I needed any higher authority to agree with me, Bruno Latour has recently said some extraordinary things about the bankruptcy of both the modern and the environmental movement with nowhere to go. About modern, everything happens if modernists were unable to reconcile their idea of science and nature, which, remember, according to their narrative, is supposed to be farther and farther removed as time passes from the law, subjectivity, politics and religion, with the alternative reality that the connections of science and technologies are more pressing every day, more confusing, requiring even more intervention, more assemblies, more scrutiny, more stewardship. We have nowhere to go. We need more narratives, and I wonder if this beautiful and ancient one might be a source for us. Thank you very much. Right.
absolutely fascinating. For the plenty of questions. I'm very grateful for some help. If someone could take the microphone around, then it would be good. They're grateful if you would capture the questions as well, if you don't mind, for the filming. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. We had a couple there. Ones.
Thanks, I really enjoyed the talk. 2 questions. Following on this final point, I was wondering if you can maybe tell us a little bit more about how you imagine the nature of this sort of conscious and self-reflective public discourse drawing on this ancient wisdom literature, because I suspect that your sort of scientist colleagues study people for whom they don't necessarily consciously appropriate these Greek myths, right? They don't know what a Pandora's box is.
Yeah, that's quite true.
But maybe they just know that it's something that you're not supposed to open. Right? So these are just narratives that we live with. But your suggestion is, no, we could actually sort of use this part and parcel of our normative reasoning.
Wouldn't that be... Yeah.
And just secondly, real quick, a friendly point, just whether there are other bits of wisdom literature that might also help make your point that you've looked at, in particular this idea that, God in Job is this thing that affirms both the order and the chaos in the world and the human nature in the world. Maybe there are also themes like this in books like Ecclesiastes where human rationality seems utterly thwarted by God's order.
Thank you. Just two wonderful questions. Yes, the first. So that's how. Okay, how does one use usefully these ancient narratives? Now, so there are 2 possibilities here. So you quite rightly say, and the DEEPEN project showed this. Some of the people and groups they worked with knew explicitly that they were thinking about nature as sacred or the Pandora's box myth, but for most, you're absolutely right. They're one of those stories that just become part of our collective mindset. Now, so one could hope that this story too is somewhere there in our collective mindset, and just needs to be triggered and unlocked in a way that it plays, and again, maybe just a background role in the debate, but it's allowed to meet the Pandora's box and be careful what you wish for stories in an appropriate way behind the argument. That would be one way of doing it. But I don't know 2 things. I don't know whether it's true that this narrative is there anymore in the same way that the others are. And even if it were, I don't know how to unlock it. But ideas, please. Right? Secondly, it might be that, in fact, the way ahead in focus groups, and very much the sort of healthy engagement around issues like the next big one is going to be geo-engineering, by the way. It's going to be huge. It's just simmering under the table at the moment. But the research councils. So Phil actually is chairing a research council advisory group on the sort of technologies that involve, tampering with the climate, sending up particles into the upper atmosphere. This is going to be a huge one. Now, when we tackle that, I suspect that the sort of focus groups that Department of Business Innovation Skills actually now use, following the GM debacle, to understand public reaction and opinion, might go down the road of preparatory discussions around our culture, our inheritance, the relation between human civilization, human community, and the natural world. I wonder. I don't think it's never been tried. So an explicit engagement before we ever said, well, now what about GMOs now then, or what about? So I don't know the answer to that. Your second question was about other wisdom literature. Yes, absolutely, yes, huge. Proverbs is another one. The hymn to wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8, but all sorts of little Psalms as well. Very rich source in a number of the Psalms that have ideas that are reflected within Job, but have different takes. And creation stories and anti-creation stories in the prophets too, Jeremiah chapter 4. So but we could talk about that a long time. That's another chapter in this book. But There is, I didn't know, but there is a theological, I don't know what to call it, school, but there's a community. I was unaware till I started doing the secondary reading around this. Theologian at the Australian University at Melbourne and NW, Norman Harble, is a bit of a kingpin, and they're called it's the Theology of Earth Wisdom, something like that. So there's a sort of web community and books and conferences and stuff. Yes.
Yeah.
Just you have a microphone.
Yeah. There's the story of Jesus going in the boat, and the tempest rolled it.
Yes, indeed.
Now the God of nature is Yahweh. So to frighten the people, he should start rolling the boat. Peter, he was the one of the once-born laborer. He got frightened, so he invoked Christ Jesus, come on to help. And Christ Jesus rebuked the wind, and all became calm. Now these chosen people, they are a nation of priests. Through them we learn lessons, and they have got a promised land that belonged to Abraham. Now sometimes this land produces fruit, best in the word, Garden of Eden, and sometimes it becomes barren. And how can the science explain same land becoming barren and same land becoming fruitful?
Thank you. So two questions there, and or two ideas. Certainly, one I think broadly within the idea of New Testament reception of some of this Old Testament wisdom. Yes, a lot there. Interesting, you chose a synoptic example from the Gospels, because perhaps one would expect to find more clearly this sort of nature engagement in John, and in fact one does. I mean, think about well, of course, John's famous opening of his Gospel makes an extraordinary move that pulls on an idea in the Septuagint Psalms of logos and ordering principle, which he then identifies with Christ. And of course, if the ordering principle of the universe is in the boat, then ordering the storm is perhaps one of the manifestations one might expect to see at some point. The second thing you mentioned is one of Job's questions. It's precisely one of Job's questions. It's the intermittent, chaotic fruitfulness of the world. When his friends point out that Yahweh, actually, Yahweh is not usually. It's not the usual word used for God in Job. It's an older one. But commands the rains, and the rains make the land fertile. And Job points out, not always they don't. They sometimes appear at the wrong time and wash the crops away. So in the Lord's answer, those two streams of thought, if you'll pardon the pun, are actually brought together. And I wonder if I can. Let me just find that, because the point in the Lord's answer at which the Lord refers to the streams. Talk amongst yourselves for a moment. I'll find it for you. Anyway, he talks about can you. One of the questions is, can you channel the rains and the water and the wind? And for me it's a rather beautiful and subtle intermediate or third position on the extremes of order, purpose, reigning, fruitfulness, predictability, righteousness and response of the friends, and Job's chaotic out of control. God's deconstruction and reconstruction of control that I mentioned in the discussion of the answer is that the way you balance chaos and order is to channel the chaos. And if you want a universe of fruitfulness and life and animal kind, then the concomitant of that world is going to be the universe of the storm and the earthquake as well. That probably doesn't answer everything, but maybe that's what I would just throw out. Perhaps sorry.
Verse 8 of that 8.
I was... okay, here it is. Yeah, it's chapter 38, verse 25. Who cuts a channel for the torrent of rain, a path for the thunderbolt? Yeah, to bring rain on a land uninhabited, on the unpeopled desert, to satisfy a waste and desolate land, making the thirsty ground sprout with grass. So it's got a lot there. It's got the decentralization, it's the waste, it's the land you don't know. You haven't even seen it. But even there are two chaotic elements of creation. There's the chaotic rain and storm and the chaotic thunderbolt. But rather than strangle and turn off and crush chaos out of existence, what Yahweh is asking Job is, do you know how to channel it? Yeah.
For some strange reason, I've always been very interested in Leviathan. And you spent a little time on Leviathan. I wonder how you see that, because Leviathan could be taken as chaos, a representation of chaos, and something opposed to God. And in certain parts of the Bible, there's a struggle between God and Leviathan, and God will defeat Leviathan at the last day.
That's right.
So I wonder how you see that.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, I could have spent more. I mean, it's one of the. Yeah, I could have spent more on. Obviously, both Leviathan and Behemoth are deserving of a much greater mention, because actually they have a chapter all to themselves in the Lord's Answer. And as I did say, they are clearly, for within the Lord's Answer, the pinnacle of the whole physical order. I don't know that I've personally got an answer for you. I'm really, to be honest, thinking this one through. I'm a bit puzzled. Whether are you making an identification between what's often translated Rahab, the sea monster, and Leviathan?
You could,
but you might not. You see, so I think well. The fact that we have two different names to call on, I think I would tend to, within context, I'd prefer to... I don't think that the Leviathan discussed in Job is consistent with a beast that one day the Lord will defeat. Because he's just so proud of it. He thinks it's wonderful. It just praises its frothing about and its magnificent tail and the plates on its back. And, I mean, it's not... It's the pinnacle of the continuity, which is the wild ox is there, the wild ass is there as well. But just the Leviathan is at the top of the mountain, and the ass is halfway up. So I don't think that the Job Leviathan is the great sea monster who somehow personifies or animalizes evil and perfection. But I think what it is doing is strongly, I think it's part of the strong decentralization or decentralization of Job and humankind generally from their seat in creation. So given that part of Job's problem is that it's all about me, what have I done to deserve this from the rest of my universe? I mean, the world really does revolve around Job in the theatre of the place. And actually, one thing I didn't say, which I should have done, and what the questions made me think of it, is that I don't know about you, but I can't read Job now without thinking of Proscenium Arch. I mean, it's a very theatrical book. It's very staged and structured. And I mean proscenium, I don't mean in the round. And there's things going on in the wings, that things being pulled off from the wings that we aren't supposed to see. And there's a stage play. And what happens, one thing that happens in the Lord's Answer is that the spotlights on the ash heap with Job at the centre and the friends around, are on some form of, like in my mind's eye, I see one of those clever stages at the Royal Opera House, I think, slowly turning at the rate you can't actually see them see it move, but when you look back, you realise that they're not in the centre of the stage anymore and what's happening. And by the end of The Lord's Answer, they're right off backstage, left in semi-darkness, and centre stage are these extraordinary aspects of creation that the point is Job hasn't even got around to knowing about. So I think the second thing that Leviathan and Behemoth do, and I think I could probably call on this for my eschatological thing as well, that Job, the Lord's Answer to Job is an arrow that points beyond itself, is to, okay, let's start off with the cosmological metaphors that you've brought into your argument around injustice with me, Job. And let's talk about the world. Let's talk about channeling chaos and what a world really needs to be in order to be fruitful, and what we mean by control. But when we dealt with the ostrich and with the eagle, now let's deal with the Leviathan. The what? Oh, you didn't know about Leviathan. But I know about Leviathan. So, okay, my reading of it is that it's part of the, you may not know now, but one day you will know about this glorious creature, and you'll be even more astonished at what's there in the world. Yeah. Does that
just one
help?
Quick question. When you speak of decentralization, do you mean that humans are not the centre of God's purposes?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay.
That's what I meant. Yeah, pardon me, it was not clear. Yes, that's what I mean by that. Yeah.
I think we'll just have maybe two more questions. I've got a final one at the end, so
okay.
maybe...
Let's see, have one.
Excuse me. I'm a bit confused about the association of the storm, the thunderbolt, the Leviathan with chaos. They don't seem to me to be chaotic or particularly disordered in any way whatsoever. I'm also, when you talk about fruitfulness, I mean, the opposition over here is fruitfulness for us. But I don't see it as an opposition between order and disorder. And I also tension in two things you suggested to me. One is that the Leviathan and the storm are important and beautiful, remarkable, central part of creation in themselves. And that's a kind of balance with what's fruitful for us, which is, that's one contrast. But the other, that somehow the things on this side need to be channeled or tamed. That one thing is to recognize that we're not at the center, that these things are marvelous. And in a sense untamed, that's one thing to recognize and to see their place in the right kind of world. Right? That's very different from saying, well, they're not fruitful for us, and one of the things that should be happening is they get tamed and channeled.
So I see. No. I'm not saying that. Okay.
Well, you do use the metaphor. I mean, you use repeatedly the metaphor
for
of
channeling and taming. Okay. Well, for starters,
you didn't use taming. I
no,
introduced
you used taming.
I used it because that's what it sounds
channeling
like.
Is not
You've
taming.
got this stuff
right,
over
no.
here. We're
right.
going to channel it.
Right.
That doesn't fit with the story that, and also it doesn't fit with calling this stuff over here chaos.
Right. Well, okay. So, and of course, chaos is not a word also used in the book. That's my reading into it, and it's my.
It just seemed to me very ordered, not disordered.
Okay. Well, storms. Well, I'm not sure. Storms. It was, of course, Job's loss of his family. There's a huge storm. Whether there's an earthquake or not isn't quite clear, but there's, I think, chaotic in the sense of unpredictable and not time-ordered. So the Job's issue about the storms and the rains is that they do not recur with the regularity that his friends say they do. So I mean chaotic in that sense. Of course, I'm not allowed to. I could, of course, persuade you, Nancy. It would be quite anachronistically that actually the storm is an example of what nonlinear systems theory people would call chaotic nonlinear systems. I mean, they actually are, and there is the butterfly effect and all that, right? So as it happens, storm clouds and hurricanes and weather systems are formally examples of chaotic nonlinear systems.
Well, they're examples of something that the high ground has been seized by this word. I mean, they're rather deterministically. Anyway, never mind. That's a subset.
Oh, okay. Deterministic but not predictable.
Yes.
So I am actually using chaotic. I'm using.
Has to do with getting class and fruitfulness.
Okay. Right. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, in principle, not predictable by humans. Yes. I'm very worried about this discussion, though, because I'm very concerned about anachronistic projection onto this, and I'm feeling that we're getting dangerously near that territory. But you got me. I did use the word chaos, and I tell you what I mean. What I precisely mean for it is that the point that Job is making is that a farmer may have planted his seeds in the expectation of rain, not got it, and they withered, or got too much of it and they got washed away. That's the sort of chaos that Job is talking about. You are right to notice that I did not use the word tame, and that was deliberate. And the sort of future that I think Job is pointing to, the book of Job, is not a future where the behemoth and Leviathan are tamed, but there might be a future where they are understood. Right.
I'd like to just make a couple of final suggestions. I thought it was such a wonderful talk, and the ideas I'd love to explore further. But two suggestions. I'd like to perhaps add another theme to those different narratives that you suggested in Job, because there's another one which is very important. It's that use of that invitation. Where were you?
Yeah.
Where were you? And I wonder whether the theme in Job is really what you might call frustrated second-person relationship. Because in the Garden of Eden, the story is first question after the fall. God asks, "Where are you?"
Yes.
And it's the onset of spiritual autism, you might say. And Job is, in a sense, he's been invited into second-person relationship with God, to love with God the things that God loves. May I suggest?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
And so that may be one of the themes to augment the list that you've added there. But there's also another important suggestion. At the moment, the study of the natural world, I think, is under attack, partly through utilitarianism and materialism. Is it useful for us? And increasingly, I imagine, in your position, an eminent academia, you must come across policy decisions that are related to why do we fund science? Why do we fund academia? And often the justification is given in materialistic terms. It's useful. But of course, a lot of the best things that are done are not utilitarian. So is there some way in which these narratives could help us rebalance our research priorities?
Yes, it might. What a wonderful question to a Pro-Vice Chancellor for research. What a gift. Gosh, I wish I'd spotted that one. So two lovely thoughts. Well, yes, I mean, I think you've rephrased what I, in a very inarticulate way, was trying to say. An invitation to a second-person relationship is a lovely way of how I was trying to connect the Lord's answer to Job and the direction that had already been set in the search for wisdom in chapter 28, which is what David Klein's found so unsatisfactory, that the knowledge of God, wisdom is the knowledge of God. But actually, when you unpack what the book is saying about the knowledge of God, wisdom is seeing and perceiving the world with God's eyes and knowing how it works and where its sinews and where its structure lies. So it is very much that same invitation, for which the metaphor is the miner dangling underneath the earth. No eagle, no ox, no lion sees. Actually, God does see. God does know that the seam of silver is just there. The only other person who knows is the miner on the end of the rope with the lamp on his hat. And I should say that that opening to chapter 28, I was astonished to find, is so strongly suggestive of divine perception that some commentators have actually concluded that those eyes are divine eyes. It's talking about God. And it's got confused. It couldn't possibly be talking about the minor at that point. It must be talking about the... So actually it's interesting that your very point is reflected in some of the secondary literature in a way that I think has got it confused. The text is always stronger. Sometimes this meat is so strong that when we write about it, we water it down, or the wine gets watered down. So the second point is very, very prescient, of course, and instrumentalism, benefit, impact case studies we were talking about before. I think the very fact that this is being filmed is in the hope that it might be an impact. Well, we'll see about that. But I'll take the hint back to Durham. We'll find that useful, I'm sure. No, of course. Well, another vital, deep debate this, I think, plays to is the value of knowledge and understanding. I'm going to stop before I say for its own sake, because just because knowledge isn't utilitarian and doesn't have a patent associated with it doesn't mean that it's knowledge, quotes, for its own sake. Actually, I'm not sure I believe that any knowledge is really knowledge for its own sake. And even the arguments I have with, well, not arguments, interesting discussions I have with people in our history department who just don't get the impact agenda well, and whatever. I think are not helped by the idea that that somehow the academic endeavour, or blue skies, or curiosity-driven stuff, is somehow proud to be pointless, as G.H. Hardy famously defended pure maths in his apology for a mathematician. I'm sure there are humanities equivalents of that. But no, I think what I'm saying is that without being immediately utilitarian, without being immediately instrumental, or without being immediately productive in an economic way, nonetheless, knowledge is of deep and lasting value in the way we heal ourselves, in the way we heal our communities, in the way we heal our histories, in all sorts of unexpected ways. And what is more, because our societies work on underlying narratives, which by definition do not have direct plumbing or electric wiring into utilitarian outcomes, but without which we know the right outcomes are frustrated, witness GMO, whatever. Well, I don't know, but someone's got frustrated somewhere there. Therefore, there is a much deeper, you could call it utilitarian. I mean, it's useful for something, but it's useful for being human. It's useful for enriching and steering human well-being and societies. It's important to get these narratives explored and enjoyed and widely disseminated. And I think you've given me a great argument when the government next, as it surely will, asks every 5 years. I mean, my colleagues, we've got to get used to this now in our universities, haven't we, folk? Every few years, we will have to re-justify our very existence and our salaries to our lords and masters in government. And hey, I'm happy to do it, aren't you? Aren't you? But that's a wonderful question. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Job, for giving us. I shall write to the minister and suggest that he also read Job chapter 38.
After that wonderful talk and questions and answers, please join me once again in thanking Professor McLeish.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.